Another day, another story. Hope you enjoy today's story. In the long run of World War II, the British-controlled Indian province of Bengal was hit by a devastating famine. Hunger and the resulting disease combined have killed nearly 1/10 of Bengal's population, or 4 million people. Recent personal correspondence from Winston Churchill came to account for all these deaths. At that time, Winston Churchill's correspondence came to explain everything about all these deaths. The famine was disastrous. The Indian people were reduced to eating leaves and grass. The people who died were piled up on the streets and villages because the people were weak and unable to cremate the dead. Parents used to throw their children into rivers and wells to avoid a slow and painful death. Others committed suicide to avoid suffering. Survivors were lucky enough to find work in Calcutta, India, or to earn food by prostitution. The Bengals relied on grain, especially wheat and rice, to survive. In late 1942, a typhoon hit the area, destroying huge amounts of grain and destroying more crops. As a result, Bengal's food stocks in 1943 were much lower than normal. These 4 million people could have lived if they had been fed on time elsewhere. In 2011, journalist Madhuri Mukherjee found a document saying the death toll reached such a terrible level because the British Prime Minister, the head of the vast empire, did not help them. Mukherjee points out that Winston Churchill's Indian policy directly contributed to the famine even before it appeared. In 1942, Japan took control of Bengal's neighboring Burma. To prevent the threat of Japanese aggression, Britain stationed important troops in Bengal. They kicked out about 180,000 farmers and occupied 175,000 acres of farmland. They also seized all ships in the area and banned transportation, even though much of Bengal's food supply came from trade in the Bay of Bengal. In addition, Churchill enacted a denial policy, better known as the burning land in the area. Rice farming and grain warehouses were deliberately destroyed by the military in case the Japanese invaded. Nevertheless, India still exported 70,000 tons of rice to support the British military's war in the first half of 1943, when the famine was over. This was enough to feed 400,000 Indians in a year. Britain, on the other hand, has increased its food and raw material stockpile to 18.5 million tons. The population of England was 14 million fewer than that of Bengal. Sir Archibald Pavel and Indian Secretary of State Leopold Amory called for food to be shipped to India to help ease famine in India. But Churchill curtly refused. He also rejected offers of help from Canada and the United States. Australian supply ships sailed directly through India to Europe. Churchill did not allow them to make a detour to Bengal to provide food to the hungry public. The British public knew nothing about the Great Famine in India because news and photos of the famine were censored in the UK. Sketchbooks depicting famine were banned by the British. Churchill reasons that, no matter how malnourished, hunger in Bengal, India, is less serious than that of the burly Greeks. It was simple, as Churchill's racist disregard for India is well documented. He despised Gandhi and dishonorably called the Hindus an animal-like people with a beastly religion. As for the crisis in Bengal in 1943, he said, "Indians, with or without famine, will breed like rabbits." But despite this undeniable prejudice, British-dominated India was no stranger to the famine crisis. India's famine was inevitable. First, the government had to make sure there was enough food in Bengal, and then give food to the famine-stricken people. However, the official Famine Investigation Committee found that the Bengali government deliberately overestimated the food production harvested in 1942. For political reasons and from systematic bureaucratic inexperience, they calculated that there was too much food for people to starve. As a result, they did not try to store enough extra food for the crisis. This situation was further complicated by delegated democracy in India, which prevented each province from exporting food to each other. To make matters worse, Viceroy Linlithgow, the Governor-General of India, believed that food shortages were purely due to greedy Bengali merchants hoarding grain. The local government also agreed with him. When the famine struck in mid-1943, the Ministry of Government could not feed the Bengals. However, in August 1943, the Statesman newspaper broke censorship rules to publish photos of famine victims. The images shocked the world and action was taken accordingly. Viceroy Linlithgow was replaced by Sir Archibald Pavel in October. He and Leopold Amery said India needed 1 million ton of grain. During the first 9 months of 1944, Churchill arranged for 350,000 tons of wheat to be shipped to India. He also asked President Roosevelt to give him 50,000 tons more, but he was unable to divert the ship to India. Fortunately for Bengal, the December 1943 harvest was enough to end the famine with late supplies brought in from abroad. Churchill's family and advocates argue that he is not responsible for the famine. They say he did his best in difficult situations, and rightly put the battlefield of Europe ahead of the Indian famine. They blamed the Indian government for failing to plan and mitigate the crisis, even though it already has a set process. But documents prove that Churchill was unashamed and cold toward India. His friends wrote about his racism. Madhuri Mukherjee points out that India was well on the way from this point in history to independence from Britain. Therefore, Churchill did not aim to help those who did not want to be part of the British Empire. India gained independence in 1947. During World War II, more than 2.5 million Indian soldiers fought for the Allies. Historians agree that India's resources were essential to Britain, which endured a huge war. The question is, was the loss of nearly 4 million lives during the 1943 famine a necessary price to pay for victory? Thanks for watching.